Hello, welcome to week 3, where we are moving ahead in time to explore the beginnings of a change in museum cultures and exhibitionary forms. As discussed last week, museums as institutions emerge out of a specific cultural and historical context to express a unique cultural ethos. Underlying this ethos is an idea of universalism and a knowledge system that assumes that the world can be neatly classified into objective categories. But think with me for a moment. What is art when put in a museum could be something else in another cultural reality. An artifact can have many different lives and could gain new meanings in different contexts and realities. A great example is the Ding vessel or the bronzeware that is often thought of as exemplary of Chinese antique art. In its original context during the Zhou dynasty or during the Shang, it was a royal vessel believed to be used to contain food, where food is cooked in. That's why it has a tripod-like structure to it and the design, right? Later on, because it gained new value as an object of great appreciation of classical Chinese past, it was not only collected privately and allow all these private scholars, collectors to commune spiritually with the longed for past or history uh, in order to cultivate a form of moral and spiritual relationship with history. To the extent that new copies were also commissioned, but principally these were used not as cooking vessels, but as incense burner, right? So it achieved or obtained a new kind of usage, a new cultural meaning, a new sort of value during the literati, when it was collected by the literatis of in Chinese culture. Today, however, where do you find this ding bronzeware? It sits in a museum as an art object, appreciated for its aesthetic value, its design sensibility, and its connection to a past. More importantly, it becomes a signifier of the classical achievements in the ancient Chinese world. And with new research, it also sort of allows us to sort of interpret uh, the Ding bronzeware on along new kinds of contexts, such as its connection to political power in sort of like ancient Chinese political system. What if we were to think of museums as institutions that also have the capacity to undergo such changes in meaning? What might these shifts in meanings mean? How are they? Where can they be situated? Here, I think going back to the terminologies of how you describe a museum in local languages can sometimes be helpful. So, my question is, what examples can you draw from languages that you're familiar with? Uh, are you able to share them in the comments on this lecture with us in class? As an example, let's look at the word for museum in the Malay language. Today, we call the museum museum with a Z. It's a direct transliteration that became popular in the 1950s with the establishment of the National Museum here in Kuala Lumpur. But prior to that, as I suggested last week, museums were initially called Ajaib Khana, or the Halls of Wonder. But following the war, because of the significant loss of artifacts resulting from aerial bombing and the increasing availability and affordability of the photograph and the camera as a technology, the museum was called something else altogether. In the post-war period, it gained a new name when it was called the Sekolah Gambar, or translated into English, it's known as the Picture School. In many ways, the Sekolah Gambar was not unlike the use of the word museum today, when you have entertainment companies calling themselves Ghost Museum or Upside Down Museum. This example of a picture of a reading library would have qualified as a scholar gambar as well. And this was taken in 1950 or 1949 in Kuantan, right? So scholar gambar doesn't only mean museum. It could also mean different kinds of information center that were set up. But what it does indicate is that the word scholar gamba encompasses a whole range of different sites in which ideas of uh, of knowledge, the ideas of what knowledge could mean and how it can be disseminated has changed in the post-war period. By calling it a schola gamba, what we recognize as museums also under this new terminology change. It is no longer seen as a hall of wonder, of magical or strange encounters. Instead, the museum is seen as a school, a scholar, set up to educate and pass on information. The historical context of this can be attributed to the increase in foreign aid by competing superpower blocs and attempts by them to persuade newly emerging countries into their political sphere of influence during the period known as the Cold War. The Cold War was the great ideological battle after the Second World War between what is known as free market capitalism, championed by the US and the UK, and many of the countries that we now call the First World, versus what is called the Second World, that many of them are no longer in existence, such as led principally by the Soviet Union, but also included China on some level as contending leaders uh, to the dominance of First World superpower. Wedged within these two superpower blocks, are the smaller countries, the newly independent countries that gain its independence from colonial rule. However, this independence, this measure of autonomy, came also with sustained losses and destructions of many artifacts due to the Second World War. But at this period in time, this is where the Sekolah Gamba becomes a new kind of space and vehicle to promote a new belief in the power of the image, the photographic image specifically, to instruct and shape popular opinions uh, amongst public, amongst the in, amongst a increasingly visually literate sort of public. The Scholar Gamba emerged through the sponsorship of many foreign aid organizations, not only as museums, but also reading libraries, where photographic images are used to circulate ideas and information about modernity, about progress, and define these ideas of modernity and progress according to the ideas of these superpowers that were sponsoring these institutions, right? Our digital interfaces today, in many ways, uh, brings the Schola Gamba into greater fulfillment. When we look at how much visual information uh, we're absorbing on a day-to-day basis today, it's almost as if we're living uh, uh, we're living at the we're living the Schola Gamba sort of like dream. Now, over time, different types of museums emerge to cater to different interests and themes. What are some of that you are familiar with? For example, there are anthropological and ethnological museums, archaeological antiquities museums, encyclopedic museums, meaning that they cover a comprehensive understanding of human history. There are also history museums or local history museums, natural history museums, science and technology museums, maritime museums, military and war museums. So I encourage you to think about the various types of museums that continue to exist today and what roles does they serve, and how do they sort of like tell the history through the chosen topic that they choose to focus on. There are also mobile museums that travel to rural communities, open air museums, pop up museums of different types of scales and ownership. With the gradual growth of museums since the Cold War, as newly independent post colonial countries began transforming colonial institutions or setting up new museum institutions, we now see an increase in the proliferation of a museum culture. And this calls for standardization. And therefore, many museums now operate under what is under umbrella regulatory body, which then sets standards for museums operations to aspire to. Now, this is where interesting tensions begin to emerge. For one thing, the idea and concept of a museum and how a museum is run, or what are the impetus that drives its collecting policy, uh, is in many ways an inheritance of the Enlightenment paradigm. And this remains the legacy uh, that shapes a museum's claim to the universal quality of the knowledge that it tries to produce. For what museum does is that in its attempt to classify the world, it also miniaturizes the world and transforms lived reality into forms of representations. Here you see a type of scholar gamba that was popular in Phnom Penh, sponsored by the United States Information Services, not as an exhibition hall, but as a sort of as a display board, using photographs to instruct the Cambodian public what does progress mean, what does technological advances mean, and how US is leading uh, this great chase towards technological uh, growth and advancement. Uh, but using these sort of uh, technologies of representation, whether through photographs, artifacts, dioramas, video or sound recording, stuffed taxidermy, or even artworks, what it does, it miniaturizes the world, makes the world much, much smaller, and transform what is a complicated sort of process in which we negotiate and live our life into a form of representation, so that other people can have an idea of this other thing, this other way of seeing the world, this other way of living the world in another part of the world that they might not have the chance to travel to. In this sense, the growth of the museum parallels another type of exhibition culture that takes place on a much larger scale. Uh, what I have on the screen here is the Pitt Rivers Museum, which is an ethnological museum in Oxford University. It still contains that hall of wonder kind of atmosphere where you are able to study objects from different parts of the world, different kinds of like culture. And in many ways, this exemplifies the encyclopedic sort of like nature of early museum enterprises as they form a network between the metropole and the colonies, and colonial museums in different parts of the world would send objects back to the colonial center, which England is one of them. And the Metropole Museum at the center would be able to build up an encyclopedic museum that has a scale to miniaturize what we understand of the world and create a sense that through these collections, it can represent the world, can represent comprehensive knowledge of the world as well. A lot of this also parallels a different kind of exhibition culture that takes place on a much larger scale. The grandest of this is the World Expo. And here I show two examples. One is the 1851 Great Exhibition in London, where the Crystal Palace was built. And the second one is 1970 Osaka World Expo. Right. Whether it operates on this sort of like grand scale exhibition, or it exists as a kind of local agricultural exhibition, what they share in these types of exhibition that brings things together is that it uses the display format of the exhibition to stage what it assumes to be a miniaturized version of the world, to make it comprehensible and to give it a form of narrative. Make no mistake though, what the museum tells us is not simply a story about the past. It is not just history that it tells. It is a temple of the muse. Instead, it is there to serve as inspiration. So the story is there. This is a story, the story that it tells is one about the future that the institution hopes will become a reality through using the past and the history as objects in order for them to mold and shape the story about what it wants to see in the future. So a lot of museums in the past not only show artifacts and objects of the past, but they also show new industrial sort of discoveries, uh, uh, plants that are that has the capacity to be sort of to be turned into cash crops, for example. Uh, so challenging the idea that the museums are actually simply storehouse of historical relics, we can actually think of museums as a collection point where history is used to chart a future for a society. However, with new museums crowding the scene, new forms of experimentation, definition, and ideas of what museums should be doing are also taking place. So when you visit a museum next time, pay attention to what kind of history it wants the public to know. How does it tell the story? Um, so perhaps what I can do now is to invite you to explore this through an exercise. And I'm providing you with the link to the Indonesian National History Museum's online diorama exhibition in this Padlet post. It is housed in the National Monument today and contains 51 dioramas in total around the walls of this towering monument that is today smack right at the center of Jakarta. But the online exhibition is now available for view on Google Arts and Culture. So let me find it for you. Uh, and I'm going to share my screen here. Here you go. So as you visit the Google Arts and Culture website, there's an online exhibit called Road to Independence. The diorama is created by Edi Sunarso, a lecturer at the Institute Seni Indonesia in Yogyakarta, and he was a pioneer modern sculptor, a very well-known sort of pioneer. What the dioramas depict are important milestones in Indonesian history. I want you to explore this section called Road to Independence. Tell me what you see. How is history narrated? What did you learn? What important points did the exhibition emphasize? What did it not emphasize? What are its biases? More importantly, study the dioramas carefully, apply visual analytical skill to pick up visual details that you find interesting or puzzling or strange. What you can do is zoom in very carefully and look at the details as well. I want you to pick up all these details, discuss them, share with us your observation by commenting on this video or create a new post of your own. You can record your voice, create your own short video response, draw something, write a text. Let's have a discussion.